What if I told you that a single horse could change the course of two lives forever, binding them in a marriage that would test the very limits of trust and survival? In the unforgiving territories of 1880s Arizona, where the desert winds carry secrets older than memory itself, a solitary Apache warrior named Running Wolf made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But here's what nobody expected. The mysterious woman he agreed to marry for that horse wasn't who she claimed to be. And on their wedding night, when she locked that door, she set in motion events that would reveal a truth so shocking, it would rewrite everything we thought we knew about love, betrayal, and the price of survival in the American Southwest. The year was 1884, and the Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under a relentless sun that seemed to judge every living soul beneath it. Running Wolf had earned his name not from his speed, though he was swift, but from his ability to survive alone in a world that had taken everything from him. His tribe had been scattered to the winds by cavalry raids 3 winters prior, his family lost to diseases that came with the white settlers, and his homeland carved up and distributed to ranchers who saw the sacred mountains as nothing more than obstacles to progress. At 28 years old, he possessed the weathered hands of a man who had learned to live off the land, the steady eyes of someone who trusted no one completely, and a heart that had grown as hard as the desert stones beneath his feet. Running Wolf's most prized possession wasn't gold or weapons, but a magnificent black stallion named Thunderwalker, a horse so intelligent and loyal that it seemed to understand his thoughts before he spoke them. This animal had saved his life countless times, carrying him through cavalry pursuits, leading him to water in drought seasons, and serving as his only companion in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to his people. The bond between man and horse was so profound that other Apache survivors would whisper that Thunderwalker possessed the spirit of Running Wolf's deceased grandfather, watching over him from beyond the physical world. But even the most resourceful man needs supplies, and Running Wolf's ammunition was running dangerously low. The trading posts in Tucson and Phoenix had stopped dealing with Apache warriors altogether, viewing them as threats rather than customers. His only option lay in the small frontier town of Millbrook Creek, a dusty settlement that had sprung up around a silver mine, populated by prospectors, saloon keepers, and the kind of people who asked few questions about a man's past. As long as he had coin to spend, the town of Millbrook Creek sat in a valley surrounded by red rock formations that glowed like fire at sunset. Its main street consisted of a general store, 2 saloons, a boarding house, a small church that doubled as the schoolhouse, and about 30 wooden structures that optimistically called themselves homes. The population hovered around 200 souls, though that number fluctuated wildly depending on the success of the silver mine and the rumors of gold strikes in the surrounding hills. It was the kind of place where a man could disappear if he wanted to, or where someone could find exactly what they were looking for, depending on their intentions. Running Wolf approached the town in the early morning hours, when the desert air still held a hint of coolness and the shadows provided some concealment. He had wrapped his long black hair in a worn leather band and covered his distinctive Apache clothing with a dusty brown coat he had traded 4 months earlier. To casual observers, he might pass for a Mexican vaquero or a mixed blood drifter, common enough sights in border territories. But his eyes, dark and intelligent, held a wariness that marked him as someone who had learned to survive in a world that wanted him dead. The general store was owned by Harold Pemberton, a balding man in his 50s who had come west after his wife died of consumption in Ohio. Pemberton had a reputation for fair dealing, but also for being shrewd enough to survive in a town where weaker merchants had been driven out by competition or intimidation. When Running Wolf entered the store, Pemberton looked up from his ledger with the practiced eye of someone who could assess a customer's worth and potential danger within seconds. Running Wolf placed several silver pieces on the counter, enough to purchase ammunition, basic supplies, and perhaps a few luxury items like coffee or sugar. But as he began selecting his goods, Pemberton cleared his throat and spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to other potential customers. "Friend, I've got what you need, but I'm afraid I'm going to need more than silver for the ammunition. Territory laws gotten stricter about who I can sell bullets to, and I've got to be careful about my relationships with the cavalry units that patrol through here." Running Wolf's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "What are you proposing?" Pemberton glanced toward the back of the store, where a woman's voice could be heard humming softly. "My sister-in-law arrived last month from back east. She's been difficult to manage, refuses to help with the store, spends her time reading books and talking about women's rights and other nonsense. She's 26 years old and unmarried, which isn't natural for a woman her age. I need someone to take her off my hands." The humming stopped, and footsteps approached from the back room. Running Wolf turned to see a woman emerge from behind a curtain of hanging blankets that separated the living quarters from the store. She was tall, for a woman, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical style and green eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with sharp intelligence. Her dress was simple but well made, suggesting she came from a family with some means, and her hands, while soft, showed signs of recent work. "Margaret, come meet this gentleman." He might be interested. In discussing a business arrangement, the woman's eyes met Running Wolf's, and something passed between them that neither could fully understand in that moment. It wasn't attraction, exactly, though she was undeniably handsome in an unconventional way. It was recognition of a sort, the acknowledgement that they were both people who didn't quite fit into the worlds they had been born into. "Mr. I asked, extending her hand in a gesture that was both polite and challenging. "Wolf," he replied, taking her hand briefly. Her grip was firm, and her eyes didn't waver from his dot. Margaret Sinclair, as Pemberton introduced her, had indeed come from the East, but her story was more complicated than her brother-in-law was willing to share with potential customers. She had been a teacher in Boston, working at a school for the children of immigrants, when she had been accused of promoting dangerous ideas about equality and social justice. The scandal had cost her the position and made it impossible for her to find similar work. Her sister, married to Harold Pemberton, had suggested she come west to start fresh. But Margaret quickly realized that starting fresh in a frontier town meant accepting even more limitations on her independence than she had faced in Boston. "Harold has explained the situation," Margaret said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested education and breeding. "I understand you might be interested in a marriage arrangement. I want to be clear about my terms." Running Wolf raised an eyebrow. He had expected the woman to be meek, desperate, perhaps grateful for any offer of marriage. Instead, she was negotiating. "I need a husband who will respect my independence. I can cook, clean, and manage a household, but I won't be treated as property. I want the right to continue my reading and writing, and I expect to be consulted on any major decisions that affect our life together." Harold Pemberton's face reddened slightly. "Margaret, you're hardly in a position to be making demands." But Running Wolf found himself intrigued by her directness. In Apache culture, women held significant power within the family structure, and marriages were often partnerships rather than ownership arrangements. Perhaps this strange white woman understood something that her own culture had failed to teach her. "What do you know about living in the wilderness?" Running Wolf asked. "I know how to preserve food, treat minor injuries, and I'm not afraid of hard work. I also know how to use a rifle, though I'm not particularly fond of violence." This was partially true. Margaret had learned basic survival skills during her journey west, but she was leaving out crucial details about her past that would complicate any potential marriage. She had not come to Arizona territory solely because of professional difficulties in Boston. She was running from something much more dangerous, something that could put any man who married her at serious risk. The negotiation continued for the better part of an hour. Running Wolf would receive the supplies he needed, plus a horse that Harold was eager to sell, a sturdy mare that would complement Thunderwalker for long-distance travel. In exchange, he would marry Margaret and take responsibility for her future welfare. It seemed like a practical arrangement that would benefit everyone involved. But as they shook hands to seal the agreement, neither Running Wolf nor Margaret could have anticipated the secrets that would emerge over the following weeks. Secrets that would transform their marriage of convenience into something far more complex and dangerous. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later in the small church that served Millbrook Creek. The preacher, Reverend Thomas McKinnon, was a thin man with kind eyes who had seen enough frontier marriages to know that love often grew from practical beginnings. The ceremony was simple, attended only by Harold Pemberton, his wife Sarah, and a few curious townspeople who had heard about the unusual union. Margaret wore a blue dress that had belonged to her deceased sister, altered to fit her taller frame. Running Wolf had purchased a clean white shirt and black vest from Pemberton's store, though he kept his Apache-made boots and the turquoise bracelet that had belonged to his grandmother. As they spoke their vows, both bride and groom were thinking about the future with a mixture of hope and apprehension. After the ceremony, they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave Millbrook Creek. Running Wolf had decided that they would travel north to a cabin he knew of in the mountains, a place where they could live quietly and establish their new life together. Margaret packed her few possessions, including several books that she insisted on bringing despite their weight. The journey to the mountain cabin took 2 days of steady travel through increasingly rugged terrain. They rode in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had committed themselves to. Running Wolf found himself studying his new wife when he thought she wasn't looking, noting her straight posture in the saddle and the way she observed their surroundings with intelligent curiosity rather than fear. Margaret, meanwhile, was wrestling with a growing sense of guilt about the deception she was perpetrating. Every mile they traveled away from civilization made it harder for her to imagine revealing the truth about her past. She had convinced herself that what Running Wolf didn't know couldn't hurt him. But as she watched him skillfully navigate the difficult terrain and provide for their safety, she began to understand that her secrets might put him in genuine danger. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and aspens, with a clear stream running nearby and a view of distant peaks that took Margaret's breath away. It was a single-room structure with a stone fireplace. built by some unknown homesteader who had either moved on or met an unfortunate end. Running Wolf had discovered it during his solitary wanderings and had occasionally used it as shelter during hunting trips. As they unloaded their supplies and began settling into their new home, the reality of their situation began to sink in. They were married strangers, essentially, committed to sharing this small space and building a life together based on practical necessity rather than affection. The awkwardness was palpable as they established sleeping arrangements and daily routines. Running Wolf constructed a partition using blankets and rope, creating a small private area for Margaret, while giving them both some sense of personal space. He spent much of the first week hunting and improving the cabin's defenses, additions that Margaret noticed but didn't question. She established a routine of cooking, maintaining their supplies, and spending hours reading by the window, occasionally sharing interesting passages with her husband. Gradually, they began to talk more openly about their backgrounds. Running Wolf shared stories of his childhood with his tribe, the traditional skills his grandfather had taught him, and his dreams of perhaps finding other Apache survivors and helping to preserve their culture. Margaret talked about her teaching experiences, her love of literature, and her frustrations with the limited opportunities available to women in conventional society. What Margaret didn't share were the details of her final months in Boston, when she had become involved with a group of activists who were working to expose corruption in the city government. She had provided information to a newspaper reporter about illegal dealings between city officials and local business owners, information that had led to several arrests and the collapse of a profitable scheme. The men she had helped expose were wealthy and well-connected, and they had made it clear that her testimony would not be forgotten or forgiven. The threatening letters had started arriving in February, subtle at first, but growing more explicit as the legal proceedings progressed. By April, Margaret realized that staying in Boston was no longer safe. Her sister's invitation to visit Arizona had provided the perfect excuse to disappear, but she had not anticipated falling into a marriage that would potentially put another innocent person at risk. As autumn settled over the mountains, Running Wolf and Margaret had developed a comfortable domestic routine, but underneath the surface, tensions were building. Margaret's guilt about her deception was growing stronger, while Running Wolf was beginning to sense that his wife was hiding something significant. Her occasional nervousness when they encountered other travelers, her reluctance to discuss specific details about her family back east, and her surprising knowledge of legal matters all suggested that her story was incomplete. The crisis came on a cold October evening when they heard horses approaching the cabin just after sunset. Running Wolf immediately reached for his rifle and motioned for Margaret to move away from the windows. Through a gap in the curtains, they could see 3 men on horseback, well-dressed and obviously out of place in the wilderness setting. "Mrs. Sinclair, we know you're in there," called the lead rider, a man with an Eastern accent and an expensive coat. "We've traveled a long way to have a conversation with you about some unfinished business in Boston." Margaret's face went white, and Running Wolf suddenly understood that their peaceful life was about to be shattered. The men outside were not random travelers or even ordinary criminals. They were professional enforcers, the kind of people who were paid to solve problems permanently. "Margaret," Running Wolf said quietly, "I think it's time you told me everything." As the men outside continued to call for her to come out peacefully, Margaret quickly explained the situation in Boston, the corruption investigation, and the threats that had driven her west. Running Wolf listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer as he understood the magnitude of the danger they were facing. The cabin was defensible, but not against multiple attackers who were obviously well-armed and experienced. Running Wolf's mind raced through their options. They could try to escape through the back window and flee into the forest. They could attempt to negotiate, or they could prepare for a siege and hope for the best. But Margaret surprised him by walking toward the door. "I won't let you get killed because of my problems," she said. "These men want me, not you. If I go with them, you'll be safe." Running Wolf caught her arm. "That's not how marriage works. Your problems are now my problems." Outside, the men were growing impatient. "Mrs. Sinclair, you have 1 minute to come outside, or we're coming in. And we won't be as gentle with your Indian friend as we plan to be with you." The racial slur hung in the air like a challenge, and Running Wolf felt his jaw tighten. These men represented everything that had driven his people from their lands and destroyed their way of life. They viewed him as expendable, a minor obstacle to be removed while they pursued their real objective. Margaret moved toward the door again, but this time Running Wolf stepped in front of her. "There's another option," he said quietly, "but it requires you to trust me completely." Before Margaret could respond, Running Wolf called out to the men outside, "You want the woman? Come and take her." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret stared at him in shock. Had he decided to sacrifice her to save himself? But as she watched him check his weapons and position himself near the window, she realized he was preparing for a fight, not a surrender. "What are you doing?" she whispered. "What I should have done the day we met," he replied, protecting my wife." The first man kicked in the door just as Running Wolf extinguished the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. The advantage immediately shifted to the defender, who knew the layout of the small space intimately. The sounds of struggle filled the night air, gunshots, shouting, the crash of furniture being overturned. When dawn broke over the mountains, 3 horses stood riderless outside the cabin, and Running Wolf was binding a bullet wound in his left shoulder, while Margaret tended to a gash on her forehead. The 3 enforcers would never report back to their employers in Boston, as they buried the bodies in a secluded grove, some distance from the cabin. Margaret tried to find words to express her gratitude and her guilt. "You could have been killed because of my lies," she said. Running Wolf paused in his digging and looked at her seriously. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning. Would you still have married me if you had known?" He considered the question for a long moment. "Probably not, but that's not the point anymore. The point is what we do now." They spent the next week discussing their options and making plans for their future. Staying at the cabin was no longer safe, as other enforcers might eventually come looking for their missing colleagues. Margaret's identity would have to be abandoned completely, and they would need to find a place where they could start over with new names and a new story. But something had changed between them during that terrible night. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement had been transformed by shared danger and mutual trust. They had chosen to fight for each other when flight would have been easier, and that choice had created a bond that went deeper than legal documents or social conventions. Running Wolf suggested they travel south to Mexico, where his Apache heritage would be less of a liability and Margaret's past would be impossible to trace. They could establish themselves as traders or ranchers, building a life that combined his knowledge of the land with her education and business sense. As they packed their belongings and prepared to leave the mountain cabin forever, Margaret found herself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. She had come west, running from danger, only to find safety in the arms of a man who had every reason to mistrust white society. He had agreed to marry a stranger for practical reasons, only to discover that their union would cost him his peaceful solitude and nearly his life. But as they rode south through the desert landscape that Running Wolf knew so well, Margaret realized that she was no longer running away from something. For the first time in her adult life, she was riding toward a future that she had chosen freely. With a partner who had proven his loyalty in the most dramatic way possible, the transformation was completed one evening as they camped beside a small stream in the Sonoran Desert. As Margaret prepared their dinner over an open fire, she found herself humming a tune she had learned as a child, something she hadn't done since before the troubles in Boston began. Running Wolf looked up from cleaning his rifle and smiled at the sound. "You seem different," he observed. "I feel different. For the first time since I left Boston, I feel like I'm not pretending to be someone else." Running Wolf nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "When I lost my tribe, I thought I would always be alone. But this partnership we've built, it's not what I expected, but it's real." As the stars appeared overhead and the desert settled into its nighttime quietude, Margaret reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a teaching position in Boston to a marriage with an Apache warrior in the Arizona wilderness. The horse that had been part of their original bargain was now carrying supplies for their journey to a new life in Mexico. The cabin where they had faced mortal danger together had become a symbol of their commitment to each other. The story of their marriage had begun with deception and necessity, but it had been forged into something authentic through trial and mutual respect. Margaret had learned that safety didn't come from hiding the truth, but from finding someone trustworthy enough to share it with. Running Wolf had discovered that his solitary existence had been preparation for a partnership that would prove stronger than either of them could have imagined. As they continued their journey south, they carried with them the lessons of their strange beginning, the knowledge that love could grow from the most unlikely circumstances, and the understanding that sometimes the greatest risks led to the most valuable rewards. The door that Margaret had locked on their wedding night had been symbolic of the barriers between them, but the events that followed had opened something far more important: the possibility of a future built on honesty, courage, and the kind of trust that could only be earned through fire. 6 months later, in the bustling border town of Nogales, a couple known as Miguel and Elena Vasquez had established themselves as successful horse traders. The man's weathered hands and knowledge of desert survival made him invaluable to travelers crossing the harsh Sonoran landscape, while his wife's education and business acumen helped them negotiate fair prices and maintain detailed records that impressed even the most skeptical customers. To the local residents, they appeared to be a devoted couple who had found prosperity through hard work and mutual respect. Miguel would rise before dawn to tend to their horses, his movements still carrying the fluid grace of someone raised in harmony with the natural world. Elena would spend her mornings teaching, reading, and writing to the children of Mexican families who worked in the silver mines, using skills she had developed during her previous life as an educator in a distant city she rarely mentioned. Their adobe house sat on a hill overlooking the valley, with a clear view of both the American and Mexican sides of the border. It was a strategic location that allowed them to monitor travelers and potential threats while maintaining the appearance of ordinary merchants. The interior reflected their blended heritage, with Apache crafts and weapons displayed alongside books and writing materials that spoke of Eastern refinement. But the most telling detail of their new life was visible each evening at sunset, when the couple would sit together on their front porch, watching the desert transform from gold to purple in the fading light. Alina would often rest her hand on Miguel's arm as they observed the horizon, a gesture that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere convenience. The marriage that had begun as a transaction had evolved into something neither of them had expected to find. The transformation had not been without its challenges. Learning to trust completely had required both of them to confront fears and prejudices they had carried from their previous lives. Miguel had to overcome his deep suspicion of white society and his reluctance to depend on another person after years of solitary survival. Alina had to abandon her ingrained belief that independence meant isolation, discovering instead that true strength could come from partnership. Their business prospered because they had learned to combine their different strengths effectively. Miguel's understanding of horses and desert survival complemented Elena's literacy and negotiation skills, creating a partnership that was greater than the sum of its parts. They had developed their own language of subtle signals and shared glances that allowed them to communicate complex ideas without words, a necessity that had begun during their dangerous encounter at the mountain cabin. The physical scars from that terrible night had healed, but the emotional impact had bound them together in ways that went far beyond their original agreement. They had chosen to fight for each other when escape would have been safer, and that choice had created a foundation of trust that grew stronger with each passing day. Alina no longer looked over her shoulder when strangers approached their home, confident that Miguel would be alert to any genuine threats. Miguel no longer felt the crushing weight of solitude that had defined his existence since the loss of his tribe. On quiet evenings, Alina would sometimes read aloud from her books, while Miguel worked on leather crafts or maintained their weapons. The sound of her voice had become a comfort to him, proof that he was no longer alone in a hostile world. Similarly, Miguel's steady presence had given Alina the security she needed to stop running from her past and start building toward a future. She could control their neighbors in Nogales, had gradually accepted them as permanent residents rather than transient traders. Elena's work with the local children had earned her respect among the Mexican families, while Miguel's fair dealing and expert knowledge had made him a trusted figure in the border trading community. They attended local festivals and religious celebrations, contributing to the community while carefully maintaining the fiction of their assumed identities. But perhaps the most significant change was visible in their daily interactions with each other. The formal politeness that had characterized their early conversations had given way to the comfortable intimacy of two people who had learned to truly see and accept each other. Alina would tease Miguel about his tendency to collect stray animals, while he would gently mock her habit of reading during meals. These small exchanges spoke of a relationship that had found its natural rhythm. The horse that had been part of their original bargain still grazed in their corral, now accompanied by a small herd that represented their joint prosperity. Thunder Walker, Miguel's beloved stallion, had accepted Alina as part of his extended family, often nuzzling her shoulder when she brought morning grain. The animal's acceptance had been an important symbol to Miguel, confirmation that his choice to trust this unusual woman had been correct. As winter approached and the desert nights grew cold, Miguel and Alina would often discuss their plans for the future. They spoke of perhaps expanding their operation, maybe traveling further south to establish trading relationships with Indian tribes in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Alina had expressed interest in starting a proper school for the local children, while Miguel dreamed of finding other Apache survivors who might be living quietly in the Mexican territories. But underlying all their practical plans was the unspoken understanding that their greatest achievement had been the creation of something neither had thought possible when they first shook hands in Harold Pemberton's general store. They had built a marriage based on honesty, respect, and mutual support, proving that love could indeed grow from the most unlikely beginnings. On their first wedding anniversary, Miguel presented Alina with a turquoise bracelet that had been crafted by his grandmother, the same woman whose spirit he believed had guided Thunder Walker to safety so many times. Elena's eyes filled with tears as she understood the significance of the gift, the acceptance it represented, and the trust it symbolized. In return, Alina gave Miguel a leather-bound journal she had been secretly preparing, filled with written accounts of Apache stories and traditions he had shared with her during their long evening conversations. She had recognized that preserving his cultural heritage was important not just to him personally, but to the broader history of his people, and she wanted to ensure that these stories would survive even if no other Apache voices remained to tell them. As they exchanged these gifts, both Miguel and Alina understood that they had succeeded in creating something precious and rare. A partnership built on acceptance of each other's past, commitment to each other's present, and shared hope for their future together. The door that Alina had locked on their wedding night in fear had been replaced by an open invitation to share whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. The solitary Apache warrior had found his tribe in this remarkable woman who had traveled across a continent to find him. The desperate teacher running from her past had discovered that home was not a place but a person willing to stand beside her when darkness fell. Together, they had proved that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with grand gestures or romantic declarations, but with a simple decision to trust a stranger with your life, and then spending every day afterward proving that trust was not misplaced.